Hello and welcome to Totnes Community Mental Health Discovery Part 1. I'm your presenter Ashley Brewer and I am here on Veer Island in Totnes. This week we interviewed Dave Fordham from the mental health organisation STEP Team. They deal with early psychosis in mental health patients. So have a watch and I hope you enjoy it. Hi Dave.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good, thanks, yeah.
So we've just got a few questions today in this interview. I hope you won't mind answering.
That's fine.
The first question was, we were just wondering, how would you define what mental health is?
I think mental health is not one thing. I think that's the first important thing to say. I think it's a number of different things. I think your mental health is something which is not, doesn't just, it's linked to the whole concept of health and the whole concept of mental and physical health. And to me, it doesn't just mean the absence of illness. So I actually believe that even somebody with a mental illness or a mental health problem can actually be fairly mentally healthy. I think it's a number of things. I think it's, for example, it's a sense of well-being, a sense of how much you get pleasure and enjoyment out of life. It might be a sense of resilience, how you deal with problems, how you bounce back when something bad's happened. It might be in relation to your relationships, the ability to relate to other people, have good relationships. And definitely, I would say, it's linked to your kind of sense of your role in life, how you're making a contribution to your community, linked to work, and a sense of whether you're sort of fulfilling your potential in life, whether you're happy, whether you're interested in things, if you're kind of, you're learning new things, you're getting out, you're having new experiences, you're taking an interest in life. I think all those kind of factors are sort of linked to mental health.
Yeah, so you'd say a lot of it is to do with well-being,
yeah,
and how you're feeling within yourself.
Yeah.
Are you feeling stable? Can you integrate with the community?
Yeah.
Can you take on work opportunities? How is your relationships? It's about, would you say it's about the standard of life?
Yeah.
Standard of your well-being?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
What's your connection with mental health?
Well, I've been a mental health nurse for over 20 years now. So I qualified in 1996 and originally did my training in Bristol, worked in inpatient services, and then since the year 2000 I've been working in various community settings, so going and seeing people in their own homes, people at different ages, and since moving to Devon 2006 I've been working for a team called the Specialist Team for Early Psychosis, so work with people with the first episode of psychosis and help and support people with recovering from that.
And what was it about mental health that made you want to pursue a career in it?
I think it was a combination of things, really. When I was growing up, I had an experience where we went on a family holiday and my dad's partner brought a family friend, her side of the family, who while we were away on a 2-week holiday in Spain had quite a severe episode of mental illness and had to be admitted to hospital and escorted back to the UK. So it was all very traumatic, and I suppose that raised my awareness of it. And then later on, when I was trying to decide what to do with my life, I went up to the Edinburgh Festival and stayed in a shared house with a friend. And one of the people he was living with was training to be a mental health nurse, and I talked to him about it. And it was at a time when I was trying to decide what to do, and it made me it sounded quite interesting what he was talking about. And then when I got home from there, I looked into the local uni and just applied and did the training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In regards to mental health, what are some of the names you can give to different mental health conditions?
Well, it's probably helpful to sort of separate things. So if you look at, probably to start with, the most common mental health conditions are depression and anxiety. So those are certainly the most common. And then you've got things like eating disorders. You may have heard of anorexia or bulimia. And you've got things like, there's a disorder called obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder. So it's kind of ritualistic, and people do feel compelled to do certain behaviours. And then you've got diagnoses which come into the sort of category of mood disorders. So you've got things like bipolar disorder, which a lot of people have heard of. Which and there's been quite a lot of high-profile people, like Stephen Fry, for example, said publicly that they've got a diagnosis of this, and you get very extreme mood swings. So you get highs in mood, and you get extreme lows of mood, sort of linked to depression, but with highs as well. And then you have what I deal with, which is psychosis, which is kind of characterised by people maybe getting out of touch with reality and having delusions and sort of believing unusual things, maybe being paranoid, maybe hearing voices, and maybe not being able to think clearly and order their thoughts. And this can have a real kind of severe effect on functioning. And in the longer term, it's linked to an illness called schizophrenia. So that's some examples.
Yeah. Would you say from those examples that some of the factors that can influence those mental health problems would be environmental, as well as some others which we'll touch on later, but definitely as well environmental?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I mean, more and more it's being understood how the role of trauma in people's lives has in the mental state. And I suppose years ago, it was often felt to be some kind of underlying biological factor, so maybe a genetic factor or something in someone's family history. But more and more, I think it's coming to, there's an understanding coming out of people's experiences and what people have experienced, particularly childhood trauma, appears to be linked to mental health problems. And increasingly, we're being asked to think about, rather than asking people what's wrong with them, actually asking people what's happened to them. So there's definitely an environmental factor. And in my work, I see people who are affected by stress, by conflict with their families and conflict in relationships, and by drug use. All of those kind of environmental factors that really do have, can definitely have an effect on people's mental state.
So you'd say environmental factors, stress and childhood trauma.
Yeah.
Is there any other factors you would highlight that could lead to mental health problems, as well as the drug misuse you highlighted?
I'd say there is, despite what I've said, there is an element of family history and genetic factors. It does increase. If someone's got two parents who both had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, that it is known to increase the chances of them having a similar kind of diagnosis. And also the extent to which people feel supported, and people feel supported in their community and supported in their family. So a big thing which has been in the news a lot recently is about loneliness and isolation. We know that has a massive effect on people's physical and mental health, so I think that's very powerful as well. If people feel cut off, lonely, then they're much more likely to suffer from mental ill health.
And what are the various treatments available for a person's recovery from a mental health problem?
Really separated into psychological and pharmacological, really. So, for example, if you're suffering from, for example, a major depressive episode, we have the National Institute for Care Excellence, which sort of defines the right care and treatment for each condition. And the right treatment would definitely be an antidepressant plus psychological therapy, something like CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy. So those are the kind of treatments. There is some kind of medication option for most conditions, but some conditions it is primarily a psychological issue, and it's better for the treatment to be a psychological treatment.
So it'd be medicine and support
Yeah.
through treatment. So
Yeah.
would be the two
Medicine
main-
and specific therapy.
and specific
but
therapies.
probably support as well. So,
Yeah.
so sometimes when people get to the point when they need some help, they're having quite a significant problem, and maybe they go to their GP, they get referred to a team like mine, a specialist early psychosis team, or more generally a community mental health team. You know, it's been recognised that they'll need somebody like me, like a community psychiatric nurse, to kind of help them and help manage their programme of care. I may not be the person actually delivering the therapy, but I would be the person that has the relationship with them, make sure they get the treatment they need, possibly would refer them to a therapist or organise a psychology assessment or something like that. So there's this idea of the person having a one-to-one trusting relationship with someone who is the coordinator of their care and who helps them get the care they need, has a care plan, has a sort of idea of what's going to be happening in the next, say, 6 months, and what the goals are for care and treatment.
Okay, yeah. With the development of medicine compared with 20 years ago, how confident do you feel with medicines available today?
I think that the medicines have improved. They've definitely improved even in the time that I've been doing it. So from when I qualified to now, the medicines have definitely, there are less side effects. So if you look at, for example, antidepressants, they certainly, 20 years ago, they were much more, had more side effects, and they were much more dangerous than overdose. So you were sending people home with a packet of tablets where, you've got a depressed person, if they overdose on it, that's a very high risk. And then they invented a new generation of drugs which were much safer in overdose and just as effective with treating mood. With antipsychotics, the same really. I mean, there are still issues, but these side effect profiles have improved. That's not to say there aren't still side effects, and we haven't still got a way to go. But I think there's definitely been improvements.
Yeah, there's been improvements.
There have been improvements, but it's not ideal.
It's not ideal. No.
We have to be very careful monitoring people for side effects, particularly weight gain, because what can happen is people end up, maybe their mental health condition gets treated, but if you're piling on the weight and you're developing diabetes and what they call metabolic syndrome, and it's giving you other problems, then that's not good either.
No.
So you can't help someone with their mental health but damage their physical health, because it's all part of the same thing. So you need to be very careful with that.
From your experience and relationship with some of your clients, what are some of the things they've said about the medication that they've been on? Have they said that it makes them flat? They've said. Is that quite common? That you said a lot of people say that the medication that they're on can make them quite flat.
Yes, I mean people do talk about feeling flat more often than not. And these are the conversations I need to have to try and work out if the benefits have got to outweigh the side effects. If something's really making someone feel worse and not helping, you've got to stop it and try something else, or stop it altogether. But yes, sedation. It is an issue. No one likes feeling sedated. People like to be able to sleep at night, and people are often happy to be given something which they could take at bedtime and gives them a great night's sleep. But people don't obviously like being sedated during the day. And then you've got, like I mentioned, increased appetite and weight gain is a common side effect, and people obviously don't like that. And you've also got things like sexual side effects, which can obviously cause people issues with their relationships. So these are the kind of things that we have to talk about. But some people, tolerate drugs very well. There is a perception that sometimes, these drugs are always causing problems and making people's lives miserable. But often people will tolerate them very well and actually not report a lot of side effects and sort of be okay and be well treated by them. So it's a mixed picture, really. It is a mixed picture. Yeah.
Looking at the therapies offered in regards to mental health in comparison to 20 years ago, Do you think that we have progressed, and in what way?
We've definitely progressed. I think, 20 years ago, we were earlier on in the value that was placed on psychological talking therapists. So there's been a massive explosion in improved access to, this is the government scheme, IAPT, improved access to psychological therapies. Obviously, CBT has become a very sort of flavour of the month kind of therapy for anxiety and depression. But there are also other things as well that therapists are using, which are, well evidence-based. Things like cognitive analytic therapy, CAT, and these are quite well evidence-based talking therapies. And I would say, in my field, it's really great to be in a team, in an early intervention team, where our NICE guidelines say that we offer people antipsychotic medication treatment, help with getting back to work and education, and support with family relationships. But we're also able to offer people now CBT for psychosis, so that's quite helpful, and that's pretty recent. And that, that's something which came out, I think, in NICE guidelines 2016. I might be wrong on that, but recently, and it's something which is now coming on board increasingly, that someone who's referred to an early intervention team not only gets medication, but also gets the psychological therapy as well.
Okay. What other countries do you think are more advanced in understanding the science of mental health than us in the UK?
That's a good question. I don't know, because I haven't had any experience of working in other countries. I know that a lot of the stuff in relation to my field, in the treatment of first episode of psychosis, comes from Australia. And Australia are very, very keen on early intervention, and really early intervention. So, psychosis is something which it's hard to spot in its early stages. But there is this concept of at-risk mental state, and people being in at-risk mental state. And if you can catch people really, really early, you can stop them ever becoming fully psychotic, and you can really decrease the risk of long-term sort of poor outcomes and people being ill for longer. And in Australia, I know that they're very hot on at-risk mental state and spotting things early. And I think, we're not as good at that at the moment, although we are getting better at that.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. So you'd say in Australia they're able to spot it earlier.
They're certainly doing a lot of work on it, and a lot of, say, the assessment tools that I use and the training that I've done, it often involves Australian research and the Australian tools. So, and I'm pretty sure that the concept of early intervention teams, it didn't originate in this country. It came from work abroad, work in places like Australia. Yeah.
Okay. What I wanted to know is, if you had money to invest in areas of mental health, where would you invest it? Support groups, alternative medicines, or research, or something else?
Ooh. I think what I see is a huge. Often people get the help when the problem is severe, is regarded as severe. So if somebody, for example, is acutely psychotic, maybe gets detained under the Mental Health Act, needs a lot of input, has inpatient stay in hospital, and there's a lot of then community follow-up from that, they'll get an extremely good service. I think there's an awful lot of people who are at a much lower sort of stage of that, but equally are suffering a lot. So you've got people, when I used to work in Bristol and I used to do assessment clinics, every week people would come in and they had depression, they had anxiety, they had a lot of social relationship kind of problems. And I think improving the access of services for people like that would be something. And I think, making sure that at an early stage people get help with anxiety and with improve all that stuff I talked about at the beginning with mental health, and getting in there really early and going into schools and maybe rather than cramming facts into kids' heads so they can pass their GCSEs and tick a box on a piece of paper for a qualification. I would say it's just as important to teach them about mental health, what it is, and how to maintain their own mental health. And I would say those kind of, those that if I had a pot of money, I would pour resources in there, and give people the tools they need to have good mental health and to look after themselves and to understand what they need to be doing to maintain good mental health right from an early stage.
Are they doing that in Australia?
I'm not sure. There's an element of that goes on in schools at the moment, but I having teenage kids who are going through secondary school at the moment and the stuff they come home and talk about that they're doing at school, I just think, it would be fantastic if they were coming home telling me that they're being taught about emotional health and emotional well-being and relationships and that kind of stuff that was going to mean that they could go through life and suffer the knocks that life will give them, but be able to bounce back and really develop some resilience. And I know it's not all supposed to be done in school. A lot of that is done as part of the family environment and growing up, but I do think more resources could be put in schools to that kind of area, definitely.
And could you give us an idea of why you think it's not going on in schools at the moment?
I don't know. I think they've just got, they've got their own set of agenda that they've got to do. They've got targets to reach. They've got a certain amount of kids, and it's the education system. So their task is to make sure people come out at the end of it with an education and with a set of qualifications, which, whilst that's important, I think emotional health and emotional well-being is also really important, and I think that could be taught more in schools.
Are people still apprehensive? What are the reasons why do you think people are still apprehensive about discussing mental health issues? And if so, why do you think that is?
I think there's still a stigma attached to it. I think there is still a kind of an othering to some extent of people with mental health problems and mental health illnesses, and I think there's a fear of it, and maybe some of it is negative stigma in the media, and every time somebody with a mental illness does something violent, it'll be the mental health diagnosis will be prominent in those headlines. So 27-year-old schizophrenic man goes out and shoots someone. So I think sometimes there's a sense of stigma, there's a sense of dangerousness around people, and I think there's just a kind of ignorance and a lack of understanding, really, to some extent, of all mental health conditions. But I think the interesting thing is, what you find is when you start talking to people, most people actually know somebody in their own lives who's had a problem. And actually, the people who I've spoken to who maybe have become unwell at work, or in the run-up to, in the story of them becoming unwell before they've got to see me, what struck me is, although there might be a sort of stigma and a lack of understanding, is people have been very compassionate. People that they've worked with have been very compassionate when they've been having problems. And this isn't in touchy-feely sort of professions. This is in, maybe very male environments like engineering or working for the council or something like that. And what you hear is the stories of people actually being very sensitive and being very caring. And I think that's very encouraging.
And what would you like to see change in people's perception of mental health?
I would like to see change this them and us thing, because I think people think of it as there's the mentally healthy people over here and there's all the rest of them, the sort of care in the community sort of them over there, the mentally ill, if you like, over there. And I think it's that if anything, that barrier between the two being broken down and people understanding that mental health and mental illness is a continuum that we're all on. We're all potentially people who could become mentally ill given the right set of stresses. Equally, we're all potentially people that even if we go through stresses and have bad times, equally we're people who can be enormously resilient and recover from things. So I think breaking down that perception of the them and us.
Yeah.
Somebody said to me recently, somebody with some problems, he said that he didn't think he did have mental health problems, because if he had, he would be rocking in a corner. And and that was interesting, because that was his perception. He was someone who was suffering problems, but his perception of what a mentally ill person was not him. It was somebody sort of who couldn't cope with anything and was rocking in a corner. So we all carry these images in our mind of people who kind of, what we think.
Yeah.
Stereotypes.
The stereotypes and the stigma, and I think what you were saying about it being more taught in schools and us getting away from just labelling mental health and saying that we all have our own mental health to take into consideration.
Yeah.
We all have our own mental health to have to concern ourselves about. It's not just people with mental health issues and people without.
No.
We're all, mental health is an umbrella term
absolutely.
for all the things that we think and feel in our lives.
Yeah.
There's just a few more questions left. What I was curious about is, what advice would you give to someone recovering from a mental health issue? And could you give us an example of some advice you have given?
I think it's to understand that recovery is not a goal, but it's a journey. It's a journey that you're on, and it's not something which is the point. It won't necessarily come where you're completely back to how you were before you had that illness. And that doesn't mean in a doom and gloom kind of sense of you're never going to get better, but I think what happens is you kind of incorporate what's happened to you, you incorporate your experience of that, and you change, and maybe you change for the better, and maybe you have stronger mental health for having gone through something like that, and you become more resilient. So I suppose that's the kind of advice, is not to expect for, if you've had a mental health sort of episode that lasted 6 months or a year, is not necessarily to expect to go back to how you were before and for everything to be sort of back to normal, if you like. And I think there's always a sense in which you're going to have to think differently to maybe how you felt before, and you maybe have to make changes to manage yourself. So you might have to look out for relapse kind of signs, make sure it doesn't happen again. I think it'd make you generally more, in a positive way, more aware of your mental health, and more appreciative of you being in good mental health and understanding how to maintain that, really, rather than just kind of taking it for granted.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it would make you more aware of certain areas in your life which you could improve on.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to a family member or friend of someone who has mental health issues? This is the final question.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned family, because I think it's really important, the role of the family and the role of friends when people are recovering from mental health problems. And I think the family particularly is something which it can be equally as much part of the problem as it is part of the solution. And that is not in any way to be blaming of the family, but some of the work that I do family interventions for psychosis. So that's about helping kind of families understand how they communicate and how they operate as a family, and how sometimes the biggest stresses for people come from their family relationships. So the advice is to sort of, to maybe, if you are if someone in your family has those kind of problems, to look at how you are as a whole, as a family, how you operate and how you support each other, and to maybe have those kind of conversations that you wouldn't normally have, but to think of it in terms of something which, how might we do things differently? How might we be more supportive of this person? Because often those family relationships can be both a source of immense support, but they can also, if things are going wrong and there's conflict, they can also be a sense of immense stress.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave, for coming in and speaking to us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
So that was our Totnes Community Mental Health Discovery Part 1. I hope you learned a lot more about mental health issues. If you want to know more, tune in next week to our Totnes Community Mental Health Discovery Part 2. Have a great week. See you next time.